So again, the reason I'm addressing these things is because they were Melchizedek and King David were the two main points that Oscar and David kept bringing up over and over and over. And I thought, what better way than to answer the questions than on live, and I was hoping that they would, join and that they could conversate and everything. But because they couldn't for whatever reason, I'm going to give the answer instead of just typing it to where only a few people can see it. The whole world can see and examine for themselves, what side they stand on. But the prophecy of King David, basically they start off saying that the Bible is a book of prophecy and that Jesus is the spiritual King David. He is David, and that he appeared in the last days and he needs to reign for he had to reign for 37 years, and he brought the everlasting covenant, and how Ahnsahnghong matched the perfectly. He was baptized at 30, reigned for 40. And so the first question that I want to bring up is, why does the Bible call Jesus the root or the offspring of David? In other words, it's wordplay. When you're learning this prophecy, they tell you that Jesus is without a shadow of a doubt King David. The Bible does not say Jesus is spiritual David. It tells you over and over that Jesus is the root, the offspring of David. Why is that significant? Because it's not telling you that Jesus is David, but that Jesus is a descendant of the bloodline of David. And so let's look at a few of those verses in Revelation chapter 22. This is one of the verses they use to prove that Jesus is spiritual David. In Revelation chapter 22, verse 16, it says, I, Jesus, have sent my angel to give you this testimony for the churches. I am the root and the offspring of David and the bright morning star. So they use this verse to say that Jesus is David. But as we're seeing here, the Bible doesn't call Jesus David. It says he's the root and the offspring of David. And when you look up the definition of root or offspring, again, it's a tracing of the bloodline or the descent, that your ancestors. So the Bible is telling you that Jesus is a descendant of David. That's important to understand, because we're going to go back to that. And then in Revelation chapter 5 is another one. Revelation chapter 5, and in verse 5. Then one of the elders said to me, do not weep. See, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the root of David, has triumphed. He is able to open the scroll and its 7 seals. So here again, the Bible mentions that Jesus is the root of David, not David himself. And so that's very important to understand. Again, we're gonna get to that. But now I want to focus on the where they get the so-called prophecy of David. It's in 2 Samuel chapter 5.
And these are all verses that the Church of God uses, by the way.
Oh yeah, they love these verses. 2 Samuel chapter 5. And this is when they start telling you that this is where the prophecy comes from. It says here in verse 3, it says, when all the elders of Israel had come to King David at Hebron, the king made a covenant with them at Hebron before the Lord, and they anointed David king over Israel. David was 30 years old when he became king, and he reigned 40 years. There you go. That's their main verse to say that this is a prophecy, that this has to be fulfilled in the last days, because of this verse that says, which is explaining a part of King David's life. And it has no foreshadowing. It's not telling you. The funny thing is, when you look at prophecies of Jesus at his first coming, there's verses that's giving you like a future tense. A child will be born. He will be called, right? You have prophecies like he will be born in Bethlehem, right? You have verses like Isaiah 53 where it says he will suffer, he's going to be broken, he's going to, all these things. You can see the foreshadowing. They're talking about the future. As to where Ahnsahnghong's prophecies are not even prophecies at all. This isn't talking about the future. They just pick something out of David's life, because there's many that he did, but they chose this one because when they do the math, they can add it up to say, well, Ahnsahnghong fulfilled this most important prophecy of David. But actually, even being anointed at the age of 30, look it up in world history, that was not strange. That was actually most people that were anointed or baptized was at the age of 30. That's what they considered like being an adult, a man. So age 30 was not anything significant. So David was baptized at 30 and he reigned for 4 years. This is where they get their prophecy, but I want to make it clear that when you look at a prophecy like this compared to the ones of Jesus, this is very vague at best. It has no foreshadowing. It's not going into the future. There's just, they're picking out something of David's life. And so the other part is the way that they say that that Jesus Christ is the spiritual King David. The way that he has to be like the David in order to fulfill that prophecy is they say that he brought the covenant. That's their main argument, besides the history part of it being 30 and reigning for 40. They say that what really the sign of David is what they call it, is they say King David was promised a covenant. And it was the God's love for David that David would bring the covenant into the world. And so they say that this covenant was brought by Jesus, who is the spiritual David. He brought his covenant. But let's look at the verse that they use to explain that in Isaiah chapter 55. In Isaiah chapter 55, verse 3, it says, "Give ear and come to me. Listen that you may live. I will make an everlasting covenant with you, my faithful love promised to David." So their point here is they say this everlasting covenant was only promised to David. So the spiritual David is going to be the one who brings this everlasting covenant. This covenant has to be brought by true David. They say David has to show the ID card of the everlasting covenant. Whoever comes with that ID card of the everlasting covenant has to be the spiritual King David. And so obviously they're going to connect this to the Passover. What's funny about this again is that the Bible never mentioned that we have to believe that Jesus is the spiritual King David. The Bible says that Jesus is a descendant of David, and that's actually the prophecy. And the thing is, I never understood why even the members brought this up when they were talking about, the order of Melchizedek. They're so quick to Matthew chapter 1 and Luke chapter 3 that talks about the genealogy of Jesus. Right? And so they bring it up, talk about, genealogy in their argument. But what's funny is, have you ever asked yourself, why is the genealogy so important, and why was it mentioned in the Gospels? Why did Matthew write a full account of the genealogy of Jesus the Messiah, and in Luke chapter 3, another account of Jesus the Messiah, even though they're a little bit different? One, what is it? Matthew is... Let's see. Yeah, Matthew traces the bloodline of Jesus through Joseph's line, and many biblicists and scholars say that in the book of Luke, it's actually tracing Mary's bloodline. But the reason why this is important to understand is, why was this even mentioned? Well, when you look at verse 1, it says in Matthew chapter 1, verse 1, this is the genealogy of Jesus the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. And then in verse 6, and Jesse the father of King David. So you see the point of why they're bringing up these genealogies in the Gospels and why it's so important is because the prophecy was actually not about 40 and anointed at 30, but it was actually that a descendant of King David was going to sit on the throne and rule. That's what Daniel prophesied about, and that's what the Old Testament prophets prophesied about. And it's important to understand this is actually the prophecy of David. Now, concerning why the Church of God brings up Isaiah chapter 55 that we read over, they say, well, now that they got you thinking the whole prophecy of David is the 30 and 40 and that he's the spiritual David, now it's easy for people to understand, okay, so if he's the spiritual David, he has to bring the everlasting covenant that was promised to David. David was promised a covenant, right? And so they say this is the Passover. Well, now it's time to see what the Bible say is the covenant that was actually promised to David, God's faithful love promised to David. Let's see in the book of Psalms.
I just want to point out while you're going to that verse too, another kind of piggybacking off of that, one of the things that they said is that when we show that, they would say only David can sit on David's throne, right? So that's why, Jesus, he's receiving the throne of David, so he has to be the spiritual King David. But when you look at 1 Kings chapter 2, it says, 1 Kings chapter 2, verse 12 says, so Solomon sat on the throne of his father David. So, I mean, it's just little things like just, like what you've been mentioning this whole time, you're encouraging people to look at the context in which stuff is written and look in and around the verses, because it's the little things that they say, like that sentence, right, is not biblically accurate.
Right. And that's one that they would say in like a question, right? Like, like it's David's like throne, so only David can sit on the throne, right? Like who can sit on David's throne? David, right? Well, and Solomon and Rehoboam and all the other kings who sat on David's throne.
Right, because they're of their roots of David. They're of the bloodline. That was actually the prophecy. And so now my main point is this, because what they say is the main sign that connects David and Ahnsahnghong is that Ahnsahnghong brought the faithful love promised to David, which was the covenant. Well, let's see if the Bible actually teaches that the covenant made between David and God had anything to do with the Passover. Let's look at the book of Psalms chapter 89. Psalms chapter 89 from verse 2. It says, I will declare that your love stands firm forever, that you have established your faithfulness in heaven itself. You said, I have made a covenant with my chosen one. I have sworn to David, my servant, I will establish your line forever and make your throne firm through all generations. Verse 24, my faithful love will be with him, and through my name his horn will be exalted. Verse 28, I will maintain my love to him forever, and my covenant with him will never fail. I will establish his line forever, his throne as long as the heavens endure. Verse 33, but I will not take my love from him, nor will I ever betray my faithfulness. I will not violate my covenant or alter my lips have uttered. Once for all, I have sworn by my holiness, and I will not lie to David, that his line will continue forever, and his throne endure before me like the sun. It will be established forever like the moon, the faithful witness in the sky. And last verse, verse 49. Lord, where is your former great love, which in your faithfulness you swore to David? So when we look at a book like Psalms chapter 89, it leaves no room for doubt. The covenant that was promised to King David, his faithful love, that everlasting covenant, was that his Messiah, one coming from, not 40 years, not having anything to do with 30. It was that King David, from his bloodline would come the Messiah who would reign on the throne forever. And that's been fulfilled. And if you read the book of Hebrews, you'll understand what Apostle Paul was trying to say about Melchizedek and Jesus. Jesus is the high priest who sat at the right hand of God, who's reigning on the throne right now as we speak. He was the one that was given all authority in heaven and on earth. Jesus was the culmination of all the prophecies of the Old Testament. And so that's what, to kind of speed up a little bit, that's what I wanted to mention about King David's prophecy.
One thing I want to point out too, just to kind of close the King David chapter, is that one of the things that the Church of God says is the sure sign by which we can recognize second coming Christ when he comes as King David is that he must bring the Passover, right? That the Passover is this eternal, everlasting covenant. But King David never kept the Passover.
Yeah, there's not as recorded in the Bible anyways. Yeah,
not as recorded in the Bible. So how is that something thatKing David, allegedly
a man after God's own heart,
the sure sign by which we can recognize second coming Christ when he comes as King David? It's just it doesn't make sense.
Seems problematic. But that's a huge thing concerning the supposed David prophecy, that there's an emphasis on, obviously, by the World Mission Society Church of God, that the Messiah, the Christ, he would reign, this 40-year prophecy that he supposedly had to fulfill. But the only prophecies you see about a length of time that the Christ would reign, it's not only here, but it's in many other prophecies. It talks about his reign, his throne enduring forever, as the sun and the moon. It's his reign is established forever. So there's no prophecy that says Christ would reign for 40 years, that there's some sort of 40-year mark that Ahnsahnghong had to come and finish up because Jesus only fulfilled 3 years of that. No, that's not in there. Jesus is said that it's in Ephesians, says he's seated at the right hand of God. He sat down, and so he's reigning now, is what the New Testament teaches. And that reign is said to last forever, not 40 years. So right at the beginning, right at the forefront, the supposed Ahnsahnghong's, King David 40-year prophecy is entirely debunked, I think, just from those passages, those verses you pulled up from Psalm 89.
And one more thing I want to mention, since we brought that up in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, since you were bringing up about the reign, also a very important part, because again, they cut Jesus short by saying that Jesus' reign was cut, that when he died, his reign stopped, right? But that's not biblical at all. Even that's what the Pharisees understood about, Jesus Christ claiming to be the Messiah. They said, we have heard from the law that the Messiah would remain forever, right? So in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, let's see Paul's understanding of this. And they say, remember, it's the reign. Jesus, his reign stopped. Even they mentioned that in comments. Jesus didn't reign for 40 years. He only reigned for 3. That's what you're taught to say in the sermon.
Right.
Well, look in 1 Corinthians 15, verse 23. But each in turn, Christ the first fruits, then when he comes, those who belong to him. Then the end will come, when he hands over the kingdom to God the Father, after he has destroyed all dominion, authority, and power. For he must reign until he has put all his enemies under his feet. The last enemy to be destroyed is death, for he has put everything under his feet. Now, when it says that everything has been put under him, it's clear that this does not include God himself, who put everything under Christ. When he has done this, then the Son himself will be made subject to him who put everything under him, so that God may be all in all. So here, the Bible is giving us a clear understanding that Apostle Paul understood that the Messiah had to reign, for he, in verse 25, for he must reign until he has put all his enemies under his feet. The last enemy to be destroyed is death. My question is death destroyed? It's not, right? People are still dying. It says Jesus will reign until death is destroyed. And that's actually, not only does this verse break down their ideology of modalism, because it's clearly telling you that the Son is going to give the kingdom to his Father. He gives it back to him at the last day, and which is actually a parallel prophecy, a mated prophecy to the book of Daniel chapter 7, when it says that the Ancient of Days, the Son of Man, was led in the presence of the Ancient of Days, and then he was given glory, authority, and power, and a kingdom, right? So this is in Daniel's vision. He saw when Jesus was receiving the kingdom from the Ancient of Days, which 1 Corinthians 15 clearly tells us it's God the Father. The reason I want to make that clear is because when we used to study Daniel 7, I heard from pastors and missionaries tell us, when members would ask, well, if the Son of Man is Jesus in Daniel 7, who is the Ancient of Days that was there with him? I thought it's one. And their answer was, the Ancient of Days is Mother. I heard that, and I was taught that multiple times by different leaders. But I never understood how and why I took their word for it. Now that I'm really understanding the Bible, I'm seeing Daniel is directly connected to 1 Corinthians 15, and it tells you that that Ancient of Days that handed the kingdom over to Jesus in Daniel's vision, it calls him by name here, God the Father. So it's not a mother. It was God the Father who gave the Son of Man the kingdom. And Jesus established that kingdom 2,000 years ago when he came in the flesh. So Jesus brought the kingdom. The kingdom is not something that can be observed with spiritual, the Bible says. And it says in Revelation chapter 1 that we were created to be built into priests and in his kingdom. So when you come to Christ, you're entering a kingdom that Jesus brought 2,000 years ago. What's fascinating about 1 Corinthians chapter 15 is that it's talking about the culmination. At the last day, the kingdom that was originally given to him by God the Father, at the last day, Jesus hands it back to who? The one who gave it to him. Why? Because at that moment, he's handing the kingdom, all of the saved, back into the Father. That's heaven. That's the last moment. That's the culmination of the kingdom. And it's so amazing. You know, it's so easy to understand the Bible now after you take that veil off and start to, study it for yourself. And even this is connected to Revelation 21 that they say is about God the Mother. No, it's not. When the kingdom of God comes in Revelation 21, it's connected to 1 Corinthians chapter 15, the verse we just read. It says, until he has put his enemies, everything under his feet. And then it says, the last enemy to be destroyed is death. Well, what happens in Revelation 21 when the kingdom of God comes down? It says he will wipe every tear from their eyes, Revelation 21:4. For the old order of things has passed away. There is no longer any what? Death. Death is destroyed at the moment that the kingdom comes to an end, a conclusion. That's when God swallows up death forever. And just like that, you see a perfect harmony from the Old Testament Daniel and the New Testament Corinthians, even to the last, book of the Bible, Revelation. And it's just so amazing. But you'll never see this if you're just always constantly looking at the Bible with these lenses, and you're basically you traded away your free will, and all you know about the Bible is the script that has nothing.